The German army of the Second World War committed many, many atrocities. And to most of us, that's not controversial to say. But unfortunately, for a good period of history, it hasn't always been that way. Following the conclusion of the Second World War on the Eastern Front, hundreds of former Nazi officers wrote memoirs meant to create a history of the Second World War and the Eastern Front from their own account. However, these histories were written by the historical division of the captured German POWs under Franz Halder, former chief of staff for the Nazis. And so they were very skewed. And it helped to found the myth of the clean Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. So before we continue, hi, nice to meet you. I'm Danny, I'm a history student, and I'm doing this historiographical assignment for my third year history class. So it's good to meet you all, and happy to be here. The history of World War II is a massive subject on its own, let alone the historiography and the study of that. So for the sake of narrowing down the topic a little, I'm going to be discussing Heinz Guderian's role as one of those officers who published his memoirs and how they set the example among the officers of ones which would go on to contribute to sort of a misleading understanding of the history. So just so you guys know, I did a first take of this and I did all this and it ended up at a half hour and this is basically how it went. This was the summary. Oh. Yeah. I'm gonna do my best to simplify and kind of shrink it down a bit. So if this still runs long, I'm sorry. I'm gonna try and insert areas in the video where you can find specific pieces of info. Thanks for bearing with me. Although it's possible to make a counter argument to this, that these memoirs weren't and shouldn't be considered historical fact, that's capped in hindsight, because for a good period of time, the decades following the end of the war, they were taken as historical fact, and it wouldn't be for another several decades until historiography would really discount these myths and sort of bring to light the reality of the Eastern Front. So because of these memoirs having their intended impact on swaying the narrative historiographically, we're going to be addressing them as historical sources and historical contributions to understand their impact on that dialogue. For this essay, we're going to start by giving an overview of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, what that is, and what the realities of the Eastern Front war. We're going to talk about Heinz Guderian and the myths that he portrays and the realities that actually existed in regards to his involvement. And then we're going to talk about sort of the broader picture of this historiography that was created and how there was dialogue and debate in West Germany in the 1980s, which would sort of bring this to a head and establish our modern understanding of these atrocities in the Second World War. This project of mine is ultimately going to show that the myth of the clean Wehrmacht and the conservative elements of German history which portrayed it, they're the result of historical inaccuracies in what was taken as historical fact through document. And we're going to exemplify these trends through Guderian's memoirs and the common myths within them. And we're going to show how these allowed for that debate and that misportrayal of this history. Without further ado, let's begin with the Eastern Front. So the story begins in 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans under Operation Barbarossa. A lot of the premise behind this invasion for the Nazis, aside from geopolitical motives, was the ideas they had to annihilate and displace the Jewish and Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe to repopulate with ethnic Germans. And although the Nazis would ultimately fail and the Russians would push them back to Berlin and end the war in 1945, this war of annihilation was done through ethnic cleansings and massacres, and they had massive, horrific impacts on Eastern Europe. And while the majority of this was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and the SS, a lot of this was also done by the Wehrmacht, which is Germany's armed forces at the time, their army. Alongside these ethnic, racial, and genocidal motivations, there's also political war crimes. So prior to the invasion, the Nazi command issued the Kommissarbefehl, which was a political order that allowed for German army units, the Wehrmacht, to summarily execute any political commissars that were captured from the Soviet Union. To understand where the myth of the clean Wehrmacht begins with this, we got to understand that immediately following the end of the Second World War, the historical division I mentioned before, so-called, were some of the first memoirs released, and they were the recallings of this war under the German officers that served. Writing these memoirs, these officers were instructed to write them not as historical accountings, but as a memoir to their fallen Wehrmacht soldiers. So this essentially allowed these officers to cherry pick and exclude details which weren't flattering. And this both showed itself in their deflection of war crimes to the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, and the leaving out of the atrocities which their troops committed. I'll get to the British and the German historians, and even a future American president who bought in to these historical accounts. But first, we're going to talk about Heinz Guderian and how his memoirs exemplify the misleading sort of portrayals that happen under these memoirs. His book titled Panzer Leader, Heinz Guderian, has many misleading details, but the most important one we're going to focus on is that the war crimes and the failures committed by the Nazis were the fault of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, and they weren't the fault of his Wehrmacht. On page 88 of his book, Heinz Guderian is quoted as saying, "The notorious so-called Commissar order never even reached my Panzer group. No doubt Army Group Setter had already decided not to forward it. Therefore, the Commissar order was never carried out by my troops either." Russell Hart's critique in his book Guderian, Panzer, Pioneer, or Mythmaker, it becomes clear that these claims of insubordination under this order of atrocities, it was just a lie. It was meant to make him look better. Regardless of the title of his memoirs being a Panzer leader and his focus on his sort of strategies behind tank warfare, Guderian wasn't just a tank commander. He was a general. And this is really important to understand because the Einsatzgruppen were subordinate to the army command on their respective fronts. They didn't operate independently. Historical fact that the Einsatzgruppen were active in the army front which he was commanding as a general. So, as Hart really emphasizes, because of his rank and because of the fact the Einsatzgruppen had to report to the Wehrmacht leaders in their area, there isn't any way that he couldn't have known that this was happening. Damning piece of evidence which Hart presents is the fact that although Guderian claims that the Commissar order was not carried out by his troops and that he acted in insubordination in refusing to give it out, there is historical documents which are reports from his troops relayed up to him, relaying how many commissars they had killed, numbering in the hundreds. So not only is he lying, but it is clear that his forces carried out these atrocities in a very distinct manner and understood the orders because they specifically relayed these summaries up to him regarding the Commissar order. Looking at these documents and looking at Russell's writings, it's clear that Guderian was not just a tank commander or a tank theorist. He was a general, and he was a willfully blind one, if not a complete perpetrator and complicit in these atrocities that were under his command at the time. Some might say, of course he lied. He's a Nazi. Of course he lied about the atrocities that were committed. And sure, this is true once again in hindsight, but it misses the mark in the fact that memoirs like these were very common from these officers, and they were used to establish the historical narrative for a shocking amount of time. And to put the final piece together, we're going to talk about how they were portrayed, how they became the historiographical dialogue for decades in Western Germany, and the people that perpetuated them from very high levels of government. To recap, these memoirs were not only perpetuated by the West German government, but by their American backers at the time. And why is because there was many former Nazi officers who ended up in the West German staff at the time under their army. And they also had the commonality in that these former Nazis and the Americans had a vested interest in knowing how to fight the Soviet Union. That explains in his book. The perfect example of this movement was the former Supreme Allied Commander and future President Eisenhower, who pivoted very quickly from admonishing the actions of the Wehrmacht to portraying them as heroes and as a good force against the Soviet Union. Eisenhower was quoted as saying, in his opinion, the fact that certain individuals had committed war crimes and despicable acts did not affect the honor of the great majority of the German soldier. And he even told the future Chancellor Adenauer himself that he had spoken and had become convinced that there was a real difference between the German soldier and the SS. That continues to note in his book, Wehrmacht History, Myth, and Reality, it wasn't just leaders that had a political interest, it was also historians, specifically British ones like Seaton and Zemke, who not only disregarded these actions as, the bad apples in the bunch, not on a systemic scale, but they focus and they have tunnel vision on the supposed professionalism, the sort of military capabilities, and the fighting spirit, supposedly, of the German army at the time. Refusing to note this, and by refusing to give sort of coverage of this, they're just buying into the myth of the clean Wehrmacht that this scale of industrial atrocities were not committed by the army at all, but by the Führer and by the SS and the Einsatzgruppe. A clear impact on the historiography of the Second World War because it would go on to influence West German historians for decades. In the 1980s, there was a great deal of controversy surrounding the trivialization of the Holocaust, German war crimes, and fascism for the sake of anti-communism, essentially. So the historians' dispute, the Historikerstreit, which began in 1986, was sort of based on this debate between the level of culpability of the Nazis and the soldiers underneath them. And with the historian Ernst Nolte, who questioned the culpability of the Wehrmacht and the nature of this war of annihilation. Among other things, Nolte said that these Nazi ideas of annihilation and Lebensraum were not unique to them, but instead they were acting preemptively and using ideas which the Bolsheviks had themselves in their atrocities committed during the revolutionary period, and he even went as far as to say that the Gulag Archipelago was the inspiration for Auschwitz. So that made many historians not very happy. Historian Jeff Elley notes that over 130 articles were written both by German daily and weekly papers, but also by historical academic journals between the period of the summer of 1986 and January of 1987. Therefore, the Historikerstreit is a really important example of this controversy in historiography, which took place in Western Germany after World War II. So, understanding Heinz Guderian's role and the role of other generals, such as him, perpetuating the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, helps us to understand the background of the debate which would come decades later. As the historian Sturmer puts it, in a land without history, whoever fills the memory, defines the concepts, and interprets the past, wins the future. This is the exact reason why understanding the memoirs of these Nazi officers and the myth of their clean Wehrmacht, which they created after the war, is very important to understanding the historiographical controversies which would occur later in the 1980s. Guderian is a poster child for this effort because while he tried to defang himself as just a Panzer leader and a theorist, he deflected and diverted focus from the Wehrmacht atrocities, specifically the ones which he was completely aware of, if not compliant with. Memoirs such as these, which were created with purpose and intent, ended up swaying the narrative of World War II for decades to come, not just in historiography, but in German Western politics. We're looking at this myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the atrocities on the Eastern Front, and the officers who peddled myths about them, helps us to understand the origins of this historiographical misportrayal which occurred. So understanding the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the atrocities on the Eastern Front which actually occurred, and understanding Heinz Guderian's role helps us to contextualize the historiographical debate which would come in Western Germany in the 1980s. Thank you for watching. I got distracted. There were some people fighting in the alley way behind my house. I'm gonna post the sources that I use because they're all interesting, and you should really give them a read to understand this much better than I could put into words in a hopefully 15-minute video, maybe 20. So thank you, and I'd like to thank my professor Wilson for allowing me to do this assignment, and thanks for watching.